Chapter 6. A Town is Born. Swift punishment fell on Bill Hunter as it had on the others the vigilantes captured. Other questionable characters fled the country, and peace descended at last on the gold camps. Lisha found his brother and William Beale excited about a proposed move into the rich eastern section of Gallatin Valley. John Bozeman thinks the eastern Gallatin has much better soil than Three Forks, Elliott said. So we went over to take a look, Buell added, and we've found just what we want. Only drawback is that the trails of several Indian tribes cross right where we want to take up land. Elliott turned his stern look on his brother. We'll have to bring in lots of settlers. If there are enough of us, we can defend ourselves. They also related how they had taken a load of root vegetables into Virginia City and met John Bozeman. He had told them that he intended to bring a wagon train over the Bozeman Trail. Yes, and he wants us to take up land and start a town in the place we looked at. He's already drawn a diagram of the town plan. They brought the plan out. Lisha wanted to see that many settlers were coming from the east. The gold strikes in the virgin lands drew them, while behind them the Civil War raged and pulled them west. The gold fields would play out, but the rich soil would remain. Early in July, Elliott and Buell took up claims of 160 acres each, and they located on equal acreage for John Bozeman. They hoped the Gallatin Valley might prove one of the most desirable places in the West. While Elliott and Buell hauled logs from the mountains and began building cabins, Lisha planned to continue his profitable business of freighting. On July 6, Jim Bridger arrived with a wagon train, and John Jacobs came in a few days later with another. When Bozeman arrived with his wagon train a month later, Elliott joined him in visiting around at the immigrants' wagons. The two used all their charm to persuade the westbound travelers to settle right here in the Gallatin. The soil is rich beyond belief, the water good and abundant, Elliott explained over and over again in his most convincing tones. It stands right at the gate of the mountains, Bozeman added, where all the tenderfeet come in with their golden fleeces ready to be clipped. The two promoters offered choice corner lots and even free lots to those who would start businesses. They induced two men, Gods and Cover, to build a flour mill. They attracted many others who paused to listen and even offered to build homes for the new arrivals. A general merchandise store established by a man named Wilson added to the town's prestige. Yet the town had not been named, and a citizens' committee met to choose a name. They could think of no other name so suitable as Bozeman. They all admired the daring young adventurer who had scouted and mapped new trails, had outwitted Indians and outlaws numberless times, and had even now, this end of July 1864, brought in a train of 600 wagons. So the new town became Bozeman. The new settlers dug irrigation ditches and planted wheat fields and gardens. Young orchids began to grow in lush pastures fenced in livestock. The first school opened in 1865, and the town took on a substantial quality. More settlers came to swell the numbers of people in the Gallatin. Lisha, now nearly 20 and an experienced trader and freighter among the gold camps in Montana, made a new friend, Billy Lee. Cousin of the Confederate General Robert E. Lee, Billy had trained to be a soldier. Although still a youth, he proved a blessing to the settlers in Bozeman during their frequent clashes with the Indians. The two friends, convinced Bozeman's bright future, took up squatters' claims east of the new town. They chose a location where the deep, rich soil could be irrigated from Bear Creek, and the two dug a canal that brought the water right to their building site. I don't expect to find anything better this side of paradise, Lisha told Billy as they dug ditches, prepared their land for crops, and built log cabins. A constant threat to the horses, the Crow Indians hung on the edges of the new settlement and stole whatever they could take. The men in Bozeman complained to the Indian agency, but nothing came of it, and the Crows went on stealing horses. Although the Crows were nearest to the town, the Sioux presented the greater danger. More warlike than the thieving Crows, they wanted other things like scalps and revenge. One day, word ran through the town that a war party of Sioux had been discovered advancing toward the settlement. With courageous leaders like John Bozeman and Billy Lee, they met the Sioux warriors where the trail crossed the divide and turned them back. Now Indian troubles multiplied. About a mile south of Bozeman, an ancient Indian trail crossed the valley in an easterly course and made a beeline for what the Indians called Yellowstone Pass. Since Bozeman had scouted and mapped the trail, the settlers called it Bozeman Pass. Along Bozeman Trail and over Bozeman Pass flowed the great tide of immigrants from the east. Wagon wheels cut into the age-old trail, and the Indian tribes of the Northwest resented the intrusion. For hundreds of years, their ancestors had used this route to travel from the upper Columbia Basin east to the buffalo hunting grounds along the Yellowstone River. They determined that the white men, even though they came in frightening numbers, should not dispossess them of their ancient hunting grounds and their legal rights. On the other hand, the settlers of the rich land determined that nothing should take their dearly bought right to live in Montana Territory. The government built forts along the Bozeman Trail, Fort Reno, Fort Phil Fort C.F. Smith, and Fort Alice. Although under treaty rights, the settlers had no business trespassing on the Indians' ancient trails and their buffalo hunting grounds, the men in the new settlements were ready to defy the Indians, the army, and anything else in order to establish and defend their homes. Another intrepid pioneer came to settle Bozeman, Nelson Story. Lisher remembered at once the reports of his part in the execution of George Ives. Story had made a fortune in the gold camps, and now he came to the flourishing settlement in the Gallatin Valley, intending to go into the cattle business. In spite of Indian troubles and the Army's refusal to give him protection, Nelson Story decided to bring a herd of longhorn cattle from Texas. Lisha and Billy Lee saw Story start off and wondered if he would ever make it through hundreds of miles of hostile Indian territory. If anyone can do it, Nelson Story can, Lisha said. Yes, he knows the risks he's taking, and he's got the money to hire good men and arm them with the best weapons. Billy Lee looked so wistful that Lisha knew his friend would like nothing better than a chance to join Nelson Story's adventure. Months passed, and one day in 1869, word flashed through the town that Nelson Story and his herd of longhorns had reached a spot on the eastern side of Bozeman Pass where he intended to set up a cattle camp with his 600 longhorns. When Nelson himself rode into Bozeman, everyone crowded around him to hear of his trek. They saw that the cowboys with him carried Winchester rifles or Colt revolvers. Story explained about their struggles against wind, rain, and dust, their fight with Indians, and their hardships because of water shortages. I knew I could do it, he said. I knew that if I hired capable men and equipped them with the best weapons, and we all pushed through with dogged determination, we would make it. And we did. For weeks, the people of Bozeman told and retold Nelson's story. Re- Remarkable exploit. He had done the impossible and done it with a flourish. Billy Lee, fascinated by such a courageous man, went to work in Story's cattle camp over the other side of the pass. Tom Cover, partner in the Cover and Mikado flour milling company of Bozeman, engaged Lisha Rouse to make a trip with John Bozeman to Fort C.F. Smith on the Bighorn River to take orders for flour. Lisha looked forward to the journey because he always enjoyed John Bozeman's company, and he would get to see Billy Lee at Nelson Story's cattle camp. Just before they were to start, a minor breakdown occurred at the mill, and Tom Cover decided to make the trip himself and leave Lisha to do the repair job. Lisha watched the two ride off and felt sharp disappointment over missing such an adventure. A few days later, some men rode into town with terrible news. John Bozeman is dead. What happened? Killed by thieving Indians. And Tom Cover? Wounded. The two men had spent their first night out at Nelson Story's cattle camp. Bozeman, usually so daring and confident, told his friends that he had a premonition that he would not come back from this trip alive. During the night, Indians drove off a number of horses, but Billy Lee and Mitch Boyer, a famous Indian scout, pursued them and recovered all the horses but one pony. The following morning, Bozeman and Tom Cover went on their way toward Fort Smith. They camped to eat their midday meal in a shady place beside a small creek. 5 Indians approached them leading a pony. One one story's men had not recovered. Both men thought the Indians were friendly Crows, yet Cover warned Bozeman not to let them come too near. Bozeman held fire while Cover went to saddle his horse, leaving his gun on the ground. Suddenly, one of the Indians whipped out his gun and shot Bozeman. He lunged at the Indians, and they fired again. He fell dead. The first bullet had pierced his heart. Cover ran for his gun, but the Indians shot and wounded him. Then they made off with the horses. Cover wandered about in a daze all the rest of that day and the following night. The next morning he stumbled into Nelson Story's cattle camp. No one in the settlement took Bozeman's death so hard as Elliott. Immediately he set out with a few friends for Yellowstone, intending to bring John Bozeman's body back to town for burial. The men came back a few days later without the body. Elliott explained that the weather and the terrible road conditions made it impossible to bring the body back at that time. They had buried Bozeman there on the Yellowstone. Later, they would remove him to the town that bore his name. Often in the days that followed, as Lysias shared the grief his brother Eliot felt over losing his best friend, he thought about the circumstances that had prevented his going along with Bozeman on the day the Indians killed him. Had a higher power ordered the events of his life and prevented him from making that fateful trip? Shortly after Bozeman's death, Fort Ellis was activated for protection of settlers in the Gallatin Valley. Now the U.S. government began to negotiate a new treaty with the Indians. More than a fourth of Montana, with much of Dakota and Wyoming, was ceded to the Indians. They received guns and other supplies as an inducement to sign the treaty. Under its terms, the government closed off Bozeman Pass and deactivated Fort C.S. Smith, which had protected it. Immigration almost ceased. Settlers on the east side of Bozeman Pass had no protection from Indian attack. The front door leading to the new settlements in Montana had slammed shut. The guns and ammunition which the government had given the Indians for buffalo hunting, the tribes now used on the white settlers. Bozeman found its position cramped and perilous. Now dark and bloody days followed in a procession of horse stealing, attack on settlers, and desperate revenge, especially from the cattlemen, who did not take meekly the plundering of their herds or the loss of their horses. The days of danger and unrest stretched into years. Lisha went out with one party to locate a band of troublemaking Indians. His duty was to find the enemy and determine their number and how best to approach them. He found the Indians a much larger and stronger force than the officer in charge had anticipated. He feared to attack, and Lisha found himself in a retreat pursued by raging savages. He, with the other scouts, fought a delaying action to cover the retreat. Lisha noticed a boy on a white mule who seemed unable to keep up with the other soldiers. He worried about the boy. Suddenly, an arrow struck the mule in the rump, and immediately he flashed ahead to take his place at the head of the fleeing settlers. The boy waved his arms and flung back a frantic call. "Hurry up, or we'll all be killed!" Lish's land had been taken for Fort Ellis, so he lived with Eliot in the town of Bozeman, but he frequently took his ox wagon on long freighting trips to Salt Lake City. Lisha always found plenty of excitement when he pulled into Bozeman after a freighting trip. People crowded around to tell him what had happened while he had been away and to hear news of the outside world, even though it might already be a month old. One summer day in 1870, Lisha found special news waiting for him. "Lisha, do you know Eliot's going to get married?" "Well, you don't say." Lisha took care of his freight and wagon and hurried home. "What's this I hear about you, Eliot?" Eliot tried to act unconcerned, but a flush of rose in his cheeks, and under Lisha's persistent questioning, he admitted that he expected to marry Sue Hitchcock. Lisha knew Susan. Everyone in the town knew her for a fine young woman. She would make a thrifty and devoted wife, Lisha felt sure. "Well, Eliot, all I can say is that Susan's a wonderful girl, and I hope your wandering days are over. Maybe you can settle down now and make a proper home." Eliot said nothing. Alicia went outside to walk the street and think about the 10 years that had passed since he and his brother had left Eliot's first wife, Melissa, and his two small boys in Minnesota. He knew that Elliot's neglect had destroyed his first marriage. Elliot had fallen in with bad company when they came west, and he had followed the same loose ways of his companions. Gradually, Elliot had lost interest in Melissa, and the marriage had ended in divorce. Too bad. On Elliot's wedding day, Lisha watched the ceremony. Susan, in her white wedding dress, looked up into Elliot's face in complete love and trust. The justice of the peace interrupted Lisha's thoughts by saying, "If any man can show just cause why they may not be joined together in holy matrimony, let him speak now or forever hold his peace." Looking at Susan's radiant face, Lisha resolved to forever hold his peace. Elliot had been one of Bozeman's founders. He had worked hard to bring about his dream to secure a home in the West. Now he had become one of the prosperous businessmen of the town. Licious hoped that Susan's influence would settle Elliot down and make him into a better man. That winter, a letter came from Melissa. She urged Elliot to come and get his two boys. She had tried to bring them up the best she could, but she felt they needed a father's care. "Perhaps now that you have a home of your own, you will want your two sons." She added that she loved them dearly and would miss them, but for their own good she had decided that they should go to their father. In April, Elliot prepared for his trip back to Michigan, where Melissa now lived. Susan stayed home in Bozeman. She had already taken her two brothers' children to care for, and she and Elliot had adopted her sister's daughter Ida. Lisha saw that Susan looked forward with eagerness to having Elliot's two boys to love and care for. A generous woman with a big heart, bigger than most, he thought. A bride of only a few months, she had already had welcomed 5 children. He gave Susan all the help he could while Elliot was away on his trip east.